So, Steph, this is a surprise. This is a 5-4 ruling from the Supreme Court with Justice Barrett writing for the majority. And she's joined by Chief Justice Roberts and the 3 liberals on the court in finding...
Hey, now.
Yep, and finding that Mississippi and other states that allow the counting of ballots that are cast by or on Election Day after Election Day, they can continue to count those ballots.
Good for them.
That's a huge victory for voters all over this country. And I will say, not necessarily for a particular political party. One of the groups that stands most to benefit from this is people who are living overseas, particularly including our military service members, whose votes likely would not have been counted had the court made a different decision. That's because, given how complicated it is to vote from overseas, oftentimes you'll have uniformed service members who cast their ballot in a timely way, but whose ballots are not received until days after. What the court is saying here is that this is a narrow ruling, and that it doesn't mean that in federal statute, Election Day is still Election Day. Nobody is contesting that. But so long as you actually fully, finally cast your ballot by Election Day, there's nothing to stop Mississippi and I believe the 14 other states that do this from continuing to do so.
Harry Litman, fair to say this is a huge win for democracy?
It's a big win, Steph. Look, this was the one of the 8 that people were most on the fence about, but Chief Justice Roberts said at oral argument, it's still the same old Constitution, isn't it? And I think most people thought it would come down to Barrett and Roberts. The other 4 were on the other side, but it's a straightforward, commonsensical opinion in the sense that it's still Election Day, and we often vote. 12 states like Mississippi and another 15 in one way or another count some votes that come in after. That's just part of the deal. And so they're saying those 2 points are not in conflict. It's really good that it happened, especially for the point that Lisa made, overseas ballots and the military. The RNC was the challenger here because they do think more late-breaking ballots are for Democrats. But it's good for overall enfranchisement. And I think it was a toss-up how it would come out, and this was one of the kind of handicapped versions.
Stephanie, I'm not one who usually speaks in hyperbole, but I was literally about to say the same thing that you said in terms of it being a victory for democracy. Here's the plain speak of all of this. You cannot say to voters that every vote counts. You cannot encourage voters to participate in the system and say that your vote counts no matter where you are if you have that right to vote and you exercise it. And then at the same time argue that your vote should not be counted because you mailed in your ballot. That is not what democracy is, and it is not how it's supposed to work. And so, as Harry just said, the Constitution is pretty clear about how this works. And so even as I might not align with Justice Roberts on everything, yes, the Constitution is still just that. And in as much as the states should have the right to run their elections as they see fit, and that is a part of how the Constitution is worded, federalizing it in this way and trying to take that away from certain states runs against the notion of democracy and our civic institutions and processes and how they are supposed to work. So while I don't say it often, this is indeed a victory for democracy, because if you were to go the other way, how can you truly plausibly maintain the idea that every vote counts and that's why you should participate?
Let's go to Fallon Gallagher. Fallon, walk us through what you know.
Yes, Steph, this is a big win for democracy, as some of your guests have been saying, and somewhat of a surprise. This law from Mississippi faced some really sharp questioning during oral arguments where the justices were weighing whether or not it can really be deemed as Election Day if the ballot is received after Election Day. Now, of course, it would have needed to be postmarked, but this is going to have massive implications for the midterm elections because 18 states and territories have laws like Mississippi on the books. And something that I want to point out, I think Lisa was saying this earlier, it is a narrow ruling, and that's significant because there was an issue that kept popping up during arguments about whether or not this could impact early voting. Of course, almost every state across the country has early voting periods, and those are really important for people. So this is really, really a big win for democracy here. Of course, something that kept popping into my mind when I was in court during arguments is what this will mean on a practical standpoint. And now, of course, like if they had decided to get rid of these laws, which is what it actually seemed like they were leaning during arguments. Barrett seemed like a toss-up, and now, of course, she's the author of this opinion. But if they had gotten rid of these laws in these states, there could have been massive implications for rural areas where people often have to submit their ballot by mail to get it in on time. And it makes me think of an October surprise where if these laws had gone away, people would have had to put their ballots in much earlier, and then maybe they want to change their vote. So for now, these laws will get to hold in 18 states and territories. And another thing that's really significant to note about this case is that this is it's a law coming from Mississippi, of course, a very red state, and they sued against the RNC. But the Trump administration actually intervened into this case. And so not only did the administration intervene and actually argue on behalf of part of this case, but President Trump actually sent John Sauer, the Solicitor General, to argue this case personally. Now, of course, the Solicitor General argues many important cases, but not every single case. Sometimes it goes to his deputy. And so the fact that Trump tapped John Sauer to come in and argue this case highlights how important it is for the administration. And the way that this court has ruled today in a 5-4 ruling, it is a loss for the President Trump.
Fallon, thank you. Lisa, how much does this decision impact Trump's super push to get the Save America Act passed?
I think it will absolutely light an even bigger fire under him, Steph, to push the Save America Act, because one of the provisions of the Save America Act is the congressional elimination of statutes like Mississippi's that
Say this again. Slow this one down.
Yeah. So Fallon was mentioning that 18 states and territories have something called a grace period, where if you cast your ballot by Election Day, it can be counted for a certain number of days afterwards. Trump was hoping that the Supreme Court would say that's not allowed, and they didn't. But the Save America Act is essentially his fallback position, because in the Save America Act, there's a provision that would allow Congress to do what the Supreme Court today has not. It would eliminate by statute any right of states to have that grace period by saying Election Day is Election Day is Election Day, and any ballot received after Election Day cannot be counted. And I want to say there's also a note of sort of a little bit of an ominous note in Justice Barrett's majority opinion. Even though today is a victory for democracy, she's saying this is not a case about the Constitution. We do not consider the scope of Congress's authority to regulate federal elections. The sole question before us is whether counting ballots postmarked by Election Day but received up to 5 days later violates the federal Election Day statutes. In other words, Justice Barrett is leaving open the question of whether Congress can make a different decision about these states that have grace period statutes than the one that the court made today. All they're saying is there's nothing about Mississippi's statute or the statutes of other states that's inconsistent with the law that defines when elections are to be held. But that doesn't mean that Congress doesn't have the right to change that. She's flagging that in her majority opinion. Look to the White House to pick up on that and put the pressure very heavily on people like Mike Johnson and John Thune to do what the court today would not.
If you said it or Fallon did, I missed it. Did they say if this needs to happen before the November midterms?
Well, first of all, in terms of what is happening today, these statutes currently exist. So all the court is saying is that the various states that allow grace periods, they can continue to administer elections the way that they always have. Nothing needs to change because nothing is changing. With respect to whether or not Congress can change the law further, they're not making a judgment about whether or not, for example, if the Save America Act were to pass, they would honor that in advance of the November elections. And I think that's a question that will have to live for another day.
But Stephanie, with something like that, as much of an ominous note as it is from Justice Barrett, I can actually live with that. And the reason why is because what they are doing in the court is they are relegating the responsibilities of legislation to the legislative branch of government and not trying to legislate from the bench. Now, you can ideologically have whatever it is that you feel about red versus blue and who's in charge in Congress and who has the majority and what they might do with it. And I do understand that that conversation has merit. But as far as the court and what the court is supposed to do, the court is supposed to interpret the Constitution. The court is supposed to interpret the law, not make law from the bench. And so a note like that from Justice Barrett points to the legislature and says, hey, if they want to make it a law, then they can make it a law. We're not saying that they can't, but that's up for them to do. And so from a process place, I think that that is the appropriate thing that's supposed to happen. What I can say as a lawyer is it's very frustrating when the court steps outside of its purview and starts legislating from the bench. And they do this more often than not. And I think that the birthright citizenship case is one that I'm watching and hoping that they don't do, as well as the case with respect to Lisa Cook and the Fed, because that's also another case with huge implications. I know I was talking about birthright citizenship. I was talking about mail-in balloting. But please know that, like, my 1A is that Fed case. And it's because of the bigger implications it has on independence, on nonpartisanship, and on public trust in ways that can really, really impact a lot more than we're seeing.
Yes, amen, and thank you, because in that case, I think the average person doesn't pay attention to it.
Right.
They're like, what? Fed governor, Lisa Cook, mortgage fraud, don't know her. Why does it matter? Why? Like, the Fed's independence is instrumental. It is so crucially important to our functioning government. And if suddenly that's not the case, I mean, if you haven't yet, if you read Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman's new book, when Jay Powell basically has a holy effing blank moment, that guy doesn't do that. Harry, what is your take here? Not on Lisa Cook, but I want to stay. Sorry, I went off on a tangent given how much I care about that one. I want to go back to the ruling we just got.
Yeah, first, I think Lisa's point really matters. It's big, but it's big because of an escaped bullet. It would have been very consequential had they gone the other way. Second, I read Justice Barrett's proviso a little bit differently. If that SAVE Act passes, the number one constitutional challenge is that Congress is usurping the authority of the states, who under the Constitution are given the primary role for time, place, and manner of elections. So they're not speaking to that, and they're leaving it in reserve. But I don't think it's a harbinger necessarily of the SAVE Acts being passed.